Hey, U.S. history students. It's me coming to you from my dining room again. And I was thinking that today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's April 21st as I'm recording this tonight. And I thought it would be important to share a lesson with you on America's role in the Holocaust. I know that many of you already learned about this probably last year in your world history class. But we're going to take a look at it now from also the American perspective and what was happening with the United States at the time of this horrific event in history. So I want to start by saying that I know, there's a lot of heavy stuff going on in the world right now, and maybe today might not be, the day that you really want to do this lesson. If that's the case, then that's fine. You can take your time with this one. But it is one that I think is worth doing. It's worth listening and reading about this. So just know that what we're going to talk about today is a really tragic event, and there are some really sad and graphic details as well. But last time we talked about World War II and America's role in it, we were talking about America's role as a neutral party. So the United States was definitely not keen on entering the war, at least not quite yet. The public didn't want to join the war anyway, because we'd had it at that point with European problems, and it was seen as something that was simply just a European affair and not something that should affect the United States to the extent that it was. So the American public was feeling very isolationist, but Franklin Roosevelt, the president at the time, was not. He wanted to join the war and was looking for a reason to join the war. So we learned about Pearl Harbor last time and how America's stance as a neutral nation was viewed not just by our own president at the time, but by other countries that were belligerent in the war as well. So let's take a look here. This is a famous Dr. Seuss political cartoon. I don't know if you guys know. I know Dr. Seuss has become pretty controversial lately, but I don't know if you guys know, Dr. Seuss also made a lot of World War II propaganda cartoons. And this one shows Uncle Sam sitting in a tree, saying ho hum. When he's finished pecking down that last tree, he'll quite likely be tired. What that means, of course, is that the United States just thought, nothing happening in Europe at the time could touch the United States. Of course, we know that that's not true because the United States does end up getting attacked, although it comes from Japan rather than Germany. In the background, you see the German vulture, which I don't know if you guys can tell, looks a little bit like Hitler. And he's chopping down all these trees labeled France, Poland, Holland, Norway, Greece, the Slavic states, Yugoslavic states, and even Denmark. And notice that he's chopping down England because England was under attack. And Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, had been virtually begging Franklin Roosevelt to get involved, but the United States still didn't want to get involved in this, other than simply just giving aid to democratic nations, meaning England. Here's another one from Dr. Seuss, which this one actually specifically seems to be talking about what's happening to innocent victims in the war. And it's this lady reading Adolf the Wolf. And notice her shirt has the slogan, America First, on it. Now, we've heard that slogan a lot lately, the last couple of years. America First, as in putting America's interests before any other parties. It's important to note that that was also the slogan during the isolationist years during World War II, before America got involved in defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But she's reading the kids a book, and it's a very scary book, and it's obviously about Adolf Hitler, and she's reading, and the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter. I think this cartoon has become pretty relevant lately, especially because there are so many things going on in the world, not just this coronavirus, but we look at all the refugee children coming from Latin America, refugee children going from Syria and Africa to seeking refuge in Europe and in America. And it's important to remember that there have been times that America has regretted not helping refugees and refugee children that needed help at the time. So that being said, this talk about refugees, let's not forget that refugees are really at the heart of this. Refugees, Jewish refugees from Europe did try to escape Europe at this time and were actively seeking a safe place, a safe haven. And many of them were unable to get it. So the Holocaust defined, again, you guys probably learned about this last year, but I just want to make sure you guys understand. Anti-Semitism has always existed in Europe. Hitler didn't invent it. It was already there. It'd been there for centuries and centuries. In fact, Jews had been forced to live in ghettos for centuries in Europe ever since really the days of the Roman Empire. And they've been persecuted ever since for various reasons. They had been scapegoats. They did not mainstream or join mainstream society until the mid 1800s, and that largely comes as a result of revolutions in Europe, like the French Revolution, and then these mid 1800 revolutions, in which people were seeking things like freedom and religious tolerance. And so, when the Jews did mainstream in society, for the most part, they flourished, and that comes with a backlash. So they had been persecuted in Europe, in many parts of Europe, including France, for decades and decades leading up to this. It is actually not until World War II, the Holocaust, that something this horrific happens, though. So the word Holocaust is actually a Greek word. It's not a Hebrew word. It's a Greek word, and it actually means burned sacrifice. And this is really a very sad definition, because we know what happened to many of the victims in the Holocaust. They were burned in gas chambers. Their bodies were often cremated and never seen again. For Hitler, though, he called it the final solution, meaning the final solution to the Jewish question. He had wanted to rid Europe of Jewish people. In particular, he wanted to rid Germany and his entire empire of Jewish people, because he believed that their land rightfully belonged to him. Much of the land that they occupied was in Eastern Europe, in particular Poland. And once upon a time, Poland did belong to Germany, and Hitler was trying to reclaim it. Jewish people, though, they have another word for it as well. They call it the Shoah, which means catastrophe in Hebrew. It means catastrophe in general, but the Shoah is the Holocaust. So there is this famous Jewish scholar. Her name is Doris L. Bergen, and she wrote a book about how the Holocaust was able to happen, and in fact, how genocides in general happen, because the Holocaust was not the last genocide. We still see genocides occurring up until this day, and many have happened since in places like Cambodia and Rwanda and Sudan. And Doris Bergen starts her book by saying, in order for a house to burn down, 3 things are required. The timber must be dry and combustible. There needs to be a spark that ignites it, and the external conditions must be favorable, not too damp, and perhaps some wind. So basically what she says is that when the Holocaust happened, it was allowed to happen because the conditions that allowed it to happen were exactly right. It was almost like the perfect storm of what was about to happen in Europe at that time. So here are the preconditions she's talking about. First of all, the spark that ignites the fire, the Holocaust, is Hitler and his Nazi regime. He did not invent anti-Semitism, but he definitely used it to his advantage to blame Jewish people for what Germany had gone through in World War I. He published a book that claimed that Jews were the enemy of Germany and that they had been conspiring against Germany from the start. He basically sees them as an enemy, not just to Germany, but to him personally. The external conditions, World War II. You will notice as we talk about this that it didn't get really bad when I say really bad, the mass killings didn't really start until World War II started, and that's when they really magnified. Why is that? Well, every single genocide that has ever happened has happened during a war. That's an important point. Why is that? Why do all genocides happen during a time of war? The Armenian genocide happened during World War I, the Holocaust, of course, during World War II, the Cambodian genocide during the Vietnam War, the Rwandan genocide during the Rwandan Civil War, the Sudan genocide during the Sudanese wars, and several other, and of course, there's also the ethnic cleansing that happened in Kosovo and Bosnia during the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. There's always a war whenever there's a genocide. That's because war provides a camouflage for genocide. People will notice if suddenly 6 million people are murdered during times of peace. But during times of war and chaos, people seem to not pay attention to the victims as much. People become numb to killing and death. And so during times of chaos, and that's, I think, important to remember even right now, because the world is going through a bit of chaos, there are vulnerable populations. And people will take advantage of abusing those populations. So it's something to keep in mind every time a war breaks out. Who are the vulnerable populations that are going to be targeted? And finally, number 3, the dry timber, the fuel for the fire itself, was the hatred, the fact that people had to be willing to accept the identification of certain members of their society as enemies. Like I said, the Nazis did not invent anti-Semitism. It's been around ever since the days of the Roman Empire in Europe. They also were not the first people to attack the Roma, who are the Gypsies, the Romani people in Europe, which were another very targeted group in the Holocaust. This is actually all the people who were targeted in the Holocaust. As you can see, it's primarily Jews. 6 million of them were Jewish people. And then, of course, there are also the Roma or Romani people, which are the Gypsies. Although people don't say Gypsies anymore, it's seen as a slur. Although they sometimes identify themselves as Gypsies, or are still identified as Gypsies in some countries. But the proper terminology is Roma or Romani. The physically and the mentally disabled, the Afro-Europeans, meaning Black Europeans, Soviet prisoners of war, Slavic people, ethnic Poles, meaning people from Poland that were not German, because remember, Poland used to be part of Germany. So there was some ethnic mixing in Poland, according to the Nazis at the time. Certain religious groups, including Jehovah's Witnesses, and also homosexuals that were outed during this time. So how it happened? Well, first of all, Hitler didn't just, one day decide to build some gas chambers in a concentration camp and then move on with it. It was actually a process that started off slowly. It starts off by alienating people first and isolating them and making them even more vulnerable. And then by the time we get to the final part with the gas chambers and the killings and the piles of skeletal bodies, many people would look back and wonder, well, how did this happen? And that's the whole point, is that it happens step by step, incrementally. And that's really the danger of situations like this, of genocides. It happens in small steps so that people don't realize what's happening. So the process that starts in Germany is in 1933, when Hitler became the chancellor and then shortly after made himself dictator of Germany. I'm not going to get into the details here because that would be a long story, and this is a US history class. But if you have questions about that, please let me know. But essentially, he becomes chancellor, which is sort of like a prime minister, and then he becomes the dictator of Germany after that, and does away with the rest of the government, except for the Nazi Party. Very shortly after, about 18 months after becoming the dictator, he starts step 1 in this process, which is the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws were a number of laws that were passed one by one that were meant to alienate Jews and classify them as an other, as an enemy, as an outsider. And it strips them of their citizenship rights. Jews were not allowed to marry non-Jews. They were not allowed to practice medicine or law. They weren't allowed to teach school. They weren't allowed to go to school. They weren't allowed to own businesses. German people could not shop in Jewish-owned businesses even before that. Jews had to step off of the sidewalk if a German person was walking by. If a German person was walking by and a Jewish person was walking on the sidewalk, that German person had a right to literally push the Jewish person off the sidewalk and physically abuse them. This was meant to take away any rights that they had whatsoever. This really allows for the public degradation and humiliation of the Jewish people. So here are some pictures, and of course you will notice the most famous of the Nuremberg laws was the law that forced Jewish citizens to wear the yellow Star of David that identified them as Jewish. Other groups had badges that they had to wear as well. For example, homosexuals were forced to wear a pink triangle. But this is the most famous, the one that most people recognize, as you can see. So they had to wear those to identify them. If they were caught not wearing them, the punishments would be severe. How did they know? How did Germans know that they were Jewish? Well, by their last name, by their birth records. The Nazis were very good at keeping papers and files on people in Europe, in Germany, I should say. The top picture, you can see these are Jewish professors who are showing up to work at the University of Vienna, and they are being barricaded and not allowed to enter the university where they teach. As you can see here at the bottom, this is an American newspaper that is publishing a headline that says Hitler deprives Jews of citizenship rights and bans intermarriage. That was actually one of the first things he did, was he banned intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews. Interestingly enough, Hitler's father was half Jewish. I don't know if you guys are fans of Harry Potter, but Lord Voldemort was actually based on Hitler. Because if you think about it, they have like similar backgrounds. Voldemort in Harry Potter, or Tom Riddle, was half Muggle, but was obsessed with this idea of pure blood. And Tom Riddle had issues with his father. His father was neglectful and abusive. Hitler had the same thing with his father. His father was abusive and just a terrible dad. Interestingly enough, it was Hitler's father who happens to be half Jewish. Tom Riddle's father happens to be a Muggle. This obsession with blood and purity and all this, all this craziness. So yeah, I don't know if you guys ever picked that up, but Lord Voldemort is based on Hitler. Okay, so these are some other pictures that show the humiliation of the Jews in public. For example, they could be searched without a warrant on the street. They could be forced to stop and clean the streets with toothbrushes if a bunch of officers stopped them and told them they had to. You can see, of course, the laughing officers in the background. But this all really climaxes on November 7th, 1938, and this takes place all over Germany and Austria, everywhere, all over the countries. This is Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. It was on this night that Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, essentially uses an event that had happened in Poland, a conspiracy in which a Polish Jewish man was blamed for plotting the assassination of a German national. And he basically, puts a bunch of propaganda out there and encourages this night. German citizens were encouraged to go out and destroy Jewish synagogues and businesses and smash windows and light them on fire. This was meant to send a clear message to Jewish citizens that nobody was going to help them, because of course they couldn't call the police. They couldn't do anything. All they could do was sit and watch as their homes and their businesses and their synagogues burned. And it was meant to send them a clear message that they were not wanted, and nobody was going to try to help them. So this is roughly 1 year before World War II officially breaks out. I also need to point out this group. Now, your book does not talk about this group, but they are the Einsatzgruppen. You've probably heard of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, which was Hitler's troops that often were responsible for running the concentration camps. The Einsatzgruppen were a particular task force, that's what it means apparently in German, a paramilitary task force established in 1939. And the Einsatzgruppen was given the job specifically to carry out death orders by shooting enemies, okay, quote unquote enemies, meaning Jewish people and other persecuted groups. And they were also the ones who were tasked with carrying out all these horrific massacres in ghettos and cities and rural areas. Some of you may have heard of the massacre at Babi Yar and a whole bunch of other really famous massacres that took place during this time. The Einsatzgruppen were literally given guns and ammunition and told to go out and shoot these people, murder them. Often they shot them in front of big ditches so that they wouldn't have to bother with burying them later. They would simply shoot them and the people would fall into their graves. It was an absolutely terrifying ordeal, as you can imagine, and not many people survived their encounters with the Einsatzgruppen. But it turns out that it was this group that would later give Hitler the idea for the concentration and the gas chambers. And the reason why is because pretty soon Hitler realized something. This was a very inefficient method for him for killing. The bullets were expensive, and often multiple bullets were needed. And not only that, but something else that takes Hitler by surprise. The humanity of the Nazi soldiers themselves was exposed. Because as it turns out, the Einsatzgruppen's troops themselves were actually traumatized by this. Many of them did not want to do this. I'm not here to excuse or justify anything that anyone did. Clearly, they did it. Many of them seem to have enjoyed it. But we have to look this hard fact in the face, that these troops were human and deeply flawed humans, and many of them had their reasons for doing what they did. Many of them were probably forced to do it. Many of them were brainwashed by Hitler. But something strange happens here. Many of the members of the Einsatzgruppen themselves simply didn't want to do this anymore. They found it very difficult to go up to unarmed people, including children. Children were being shot point blank and thrown into these graves. Many of them found that they just couldn't do it anymore. Many of them were going into shock, or they were becoming depressed. So Hitler realized he needed a less personal method, something that didn't involve shooting a person point blank in their body or in their face. And it's in this strange way, this shred of humanity that actually inspires more inhumanity from Hitler. The strange twist of irony. So a lot of people ask, well, why didn't they just leave? Why did the Jews stay there? Why didn't they leave? Why didn't they fight back? Well, they did. Many of them did leave, and they did fight back. The problem, though, of course, is that the German army and the SS were incredibly well armed. But they did leave. Many of them went to the United States, or they ended up in Latin America in countries like Peru, Argentina, Mexico, Venezuela. A lot of them didn't go that far. Some of them could only make it to other parts of Europe where they thought they were safe. Many of them went to France, to Italy. Some even went to Poland. A few went to the Netherlands and even Scandinavia. Unfortunately, they would not be safe there for long because Hitler would invade all of those places. You guys are probably familiar with Anne Frank. Her family moved from Germany to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, and a few years later, the Nazis took over. So many Jews did leave, but they went places thinking they were safe, and once Germany invaded, it was too late. However, many of them couldn't leave, and that's an important point, is that the Nazis actually made it very difficult for them to leave in this very cruel twist, a cruel joke that they would play on them. They would tell them to leave, and then they would make it nearly impossible. For example, one of the Nuremberg laws that was passed actually forbid Jews from taking more than $4 with them out of the country, making it practically impossible for them to go anywhere. And this is where the United States comes in. There were immigration limits in other countries, especially because these other countries, including the United States, didn't want to take in poor immigrants. They didn't want to take in immigrants that they thought would become like a public charge or a public burden. And if you've only got $4 coming into the country, you're essentially a poor immigrant. So there were many countries, not just the United States, many countries passed immigration quotas and simply would not bend, would not change, even though the news coming from Europe about this was absolutely horrific. Also, many Jews didn't leave simply because they never imagined it would be that bad. Don't forget, Jews were used to persecution in Europe, and they just kind of figured they'd have to wait it out, and one day Hitler wouldn't be in power anymore, and they figured they would just get by. They never imagined how bad it would actually be. I want to tell you about this one event called the St. Louis Affair. Maybe some of you guys have heard of it. On May 27th, 1939, this is actually a couple months before the outbreak of the war itself, like the actual official outbreak of the war. There was a ship carrying 930 Jewish refugees. It's called the SS St. Louis, and it landed in Havana, Cuba. And there they were supposed to be processed for immigration to come to the United States. But apparently, the Cuban immigration office didn't issue their certificates properly. I'm not sure what exactly went wrong, but the United States would not allow them to come ashore. In fact, the captain of the ship just circled around the coast of Florida for days and days and days, waiting for permission to come aboard. The United States denied them permission. The SS St. Louis was forced to return to Europe, and most of the people who were on board that ship ended up dying in the camps. It's a really tragic story about what happens when we don't open our doors to refugees. And don't forget that many of the people who eventually did make it into the United States, some of the refugees that came were people like Albert Einstein, who was escaping Nazi persecution in Germany as well. So who knows what other geniuses and contributors may have been aboard ships like that. So once the Nuremberg laws are passed, once they've been alienated, they've had their rights stripped of them, the next step was to put them all in one place, the ghetto. So Jews were forced to leave their homes, literally give up their property, and relocate to ghettos. And ghettos had walls around them. Now, in the old days of Europe, Jews had often lived in ghettos. Remember I said they had mainstreamed in the mid-1800s. This didn't just happen in Germany. This happened in every country that the Nazis invaded, including Poland, especially Poland because of its large Jewish population. This way they could be more easily surrounded and concentrated in one area and could be subjected to more abuse since they were policed by Nazi officers. So here are some images showing you what life in the ghettos was like. They were constantly supervised, constantly harassed. They couldn't leave the ghetto without permission, even if it was to go to work. And they would often be escorted in large numbers like this by armed German soldiers. The next step, once they were in the ghetto, and again, I have to say, many Jews thought the ghetto was going to be it. Like many of them thought this would be where they would have to, live out the rest of their days. They just figured the ghetto was the final stop here. It was not. From the ghetto, they could then be taken very easily to the concentration camps. This was called the liquidation of the ghettos, in which the ghettos would be emptied and searched violently. Essentially, trucks of German officers would show up and run screaming and yelling orders through the street saying, "Everybody out, everybody get out, everybody pack your suitcases and get into the street now." And so, of course, these families would be terrified, but they were all told to pack suitcases and get on the trains. So they would be sorted onto these trains. Often the families were separated. Mothers and fathers and men and women, husbands and wives were separated from each other. But interestingly enough, they were told to pack their suitcases and get on. As many of you probably know, the suitcases never made it to the camps. Their personal belongings were taken and sorted by Nazi officers, including things like shoes and jewelry and other personal possessions. Once they arrived at the camps, they were sorted and they were given work assignments. Their heads were shaved. This was apparently told, they were told it was their hair was needed for something for German U-boats, but it was to avoid the lice since cleanliness and showers weren't really available. The families, of course, were separated from each other. Many of them never saw each other again, and many of them were sent to work as slaves in German factories or other forms of slave labor in the camps. So this is where we get to that final solution. It wasn't until 1941, and this is now 2 years into the war, that the first death camps were built. And these camps, of course, were built for the purpose of killing people in mass numbers. And some of the more famous camps you know of are Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, or Treblinka. This is Hitler's final solution. Remember, the Einsatzgruppen was not an efficient way to kill people, not for Hitler. And so he comes up with this idea of these death camps with gas chambers and crematoriums. And many victims, of course, also starved to death in the camps as well. They would arrive by cattle train, which were freezing in the winter, sweltering hot in the summer. No bathrooms or anything like that on these, and the journey would be days long sometimes. So here you see a photograph of some people arriving at Auschwitz. It's massive numbers. The chimney in the background there is the crematorium at Auschwitz. The life in the camps was crowded, unsanitary, unhygienic, riddled with disease and starvation and abuse. And this is how they slept in these barracks. You might notice that in the background here, this space right here, that is Elie Wiesel. He wrote the book Night, which you might have read last year as sophomores. So let's get to the last part here. The camps were eventually liberated towards the end of the war as the Allied troops closed in on Germany. So the camps were liberated by Soviet, British, French, and American troops. Many soldiers did not know. They had no idea. They were shocked by what they would find. Many of them accidentally stumbled upon these camps. They didn't really know these things existed, or they thought simply it was just a place where prisoners of war were being kept. So when they stumbled upon these camps with these massive piles of skeletal bodies and crematoriums and gas chambers and ovens and all these horrific things, these troops were blown away, traumatized even by this. It was on April 11th, 1945, that United States troops liberated Buchenwald concentration camp. I should also note here that the Allied soldiers, many of them were in such shock that they took their anger out on German citizens in nearby towns. Here is a picture from April 16th, 1945 at Buchenwald. You see in the background here are American commanders, American troops, and they are standing next to literally a truckload of skeletal bodies, what many Jewish people call that a Shoah pile. And this is because when the Nazis left, when they fled, and once the Allies were closing in on them, they left the bodies where they were. They left them unburied and uncremated. So soldiers happened to come in and find these piles of dead bodies, which was a horrific sight. The soldiers were so shocked that they went into the nearby towns and they grabbed German citizens. As you see here, there's men, women, young and old. And to punish them, actually forced them to start burying and sorting the bodies and dig the mass graves for them. For the German citizens who were there, this was pretty shocking to them. They had been bystanders. Some had known about it, some had not. But the Allied soldiers certainly took it out on them and punished them for their indifference. So in the end, what role does everyone play here? I mean, everyone in the world played a role in the Holocaust who was alive at the time, whether they meant to or not. Because during this time, you were either a victim, you were a perpetrator, you were a bystander, or you were a liberator or rescuer. Every single person in the world at the time played one of those roles. So the question here that we ask ourselves as Americans is, what roles did the United States play? What were we? Some people might say that we were both bystanders and also liberators. But could an argument be made for anything else? And what lesson do you think America learned from this horrific event? After all, when it happened, America promised itself that something like this could never happen again. And yet it has. We know that there have been other genocides. So what should we do with this knowledge that we have gained from the Holocaust, with what we know about refugees, with what we know about persecuted peoples? What should we do with that as a nation today? So what I'm going to have you guys do is you're going to fill out the reading guide in Google Classroom that I am setting up for you. And at the end, you have your reflective question in which you're going to answer those questions for me. In your book, you can use either my lecture or your textbook, Chapter 11, Lesson 3, to fill in the answers as well. You will find it here, okay? So anyway, guys, that's my lesson on the Holocaust, recorded today, April 21st, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day. I will be posting some other assignments shortly, but I hope you have learned something new from my video lecture today. I put a lot of thought into it, and I hope that you have gained something new and enjoyed listening to it. Thanks, guys. I'll catch you later.